Hello, welcome to North Country History. This is Rob, and today we are going to go on a journey to Hartwick Pines State Park, and we're going to talk to my old coworker and good friend Craig Kasmer about the wildlife of the forest. So sit back, settle in, and enjoy the show. North Country History with Rob Berg, your podcast on the forest history of the Great Lakes region. All right, we're back at Hartwick Pines and with Craig Kasmer. So why don't you say hello, Craig?
How you doing?
Craig, so you've been here at Hartwick Pines for quite a while. Let me give you everybody just a brief bio of you. Craig is the park interpreter, also known as the naturalist here at Hartwick Pines State Park. And he's been at Hartwick since March of 2002. I remember when Craig started, I had been here from 1998 to 2013, so we worked for 11 years together. Craig's originally from Metro Detroit, and he's a forester by training, education, with his degree from Michigan State University, and also has a background in fine arts, theater, and the visual arts. Craig is an avid birder, golfer. He belongs to the local curling club, and his favorite thing to do on his days off is to sit on the beach with a crossword puzzle, staying away from people when you don't have to be.
That's right.
So welcome to the show, Craig.
Thank you, Rob.
And we're going to talk today, as I mentioned, about the wildlife of the forest. So, Craig, since you are the expert here on the forest and with wildlife, with all of the work you've done over the years as a naturalist and park interpreter, why don't you tell me a little bit about, or tell us a little bit about what we have in our forests here in the north, in northern Michigan and Wisconsin, Minnesota,
Sure.
Ontario. What trees are found there and the wildlife?
Well, let's look at it from a broader scape, right? So when you look at northern Michigan and you head west past Lake Michigan into Wisconsin and into Minnesota, that forest type, all three of these states have the similar forest type in the north and into the south. So we look at Michigan, we'll go back to Michigan specifically, from Saginaw to Muskegon, we call that the transition zone, right? So the southern hardwood species that come up from the Ohio Valley only go up to, around that transition or tension zone. And then when you get to the northern part of Michigan, you get to more of the coniferous species. So your pines and spruces and firs. That's up in the UP. And those are the ones that come down from Canada, right? So when you look at wildlife, it's based on what forest types we have. And so even though you find the gray squirrel, for example, is found throughout Michigan, north and south. But the fox squirrel, for example, is found more in southern Michigan. It's just where it belongs, right? So from the forest standpoint, that's where you find certain animals. And of course, we don't have just forests here. In even historically, we had areas that were grasslands without forests, maybe some small shrubs and that sort of thing, but nothing in terms of, well, that's a forest, right? So in certain areas, you'll find certain species based on the land form it is, right? So if we're excluding an open grassland area where you're most likely to see badgers, for example, because there's no root systems, they burrow into the ground, there's lots of rodents for them to eat. But when you get to forest types, now you're looking at the carrying capacity of a certain forest type. And what I mean by that is that how many of one species can be sustained by living in a forest. So, for example, let's take specific Hartwick pines. We've got a lot of deer here, and that's affecting the regeneration of the forest, which is good because the deer had to walk around in what we call dog hair, a bunch of small saplings. That's not good for them. They've got to run away from predators. Well, at Hartwick Pines, we've got a lot of deer, so they nibble all that lower vegetation, and we also have limits to hunting in the old growth specifically. And so that's where we see a lot of our deer activity because they feel safe there. Bear, of course, are found in northern Michigan, more to the south into the Cadillac areas where we see the epicenter. But of course, most of our bear population is found in the Upper Peninsula. Wolves, of course, have come back too. Those are primarily in the UP. There have been some sightings of wolves in the northern lower, but we're not aware from a DNR standpoint of any packs of wolves. Yeah. Pine marten is a species of weasel that is found primarily in the UP. A colleague of mine says if you want to see a pine marten, let's say you go to Quamana Falls, go by the dumpster. It's the easiest way to, and I'm like, but that's not right. I want to see in the woods chewing on a chipmunk or something. And no, they're rodents up there, basically. They're not rodents, but that's what a lot of people think of them. We've seen tracks and scat here at Hartwick Pines. I've never seen a pine marten, a live one yet. But we know a couple of years ago, you find this interesting, Rob. We do guided snowshoe hikes in the wintertime, and took an area that I didn't normally go to, and there were prints on the ground. And I'm like, what are these of? And they weren't melted. So when you get a print and everything melts, it gets wider. So everybody's like, we saw wolf tracks. I'm like, no, it was probably a Labrador retriever that has melted. This track, I measured it, got my guide out, took pictures. I thought it was a fisher track. And so I put up a game camera, saw where it was going up to the snag, and there was a hole up there. And I'm like, okay, well, the texture of the wood, no bark, was all scraped, and you could tell something was climbing up and down it. I got over 300 pictures from the game cam, and it was just the snow melting. So I never got anything that was conducive to like, aha, right? Yeah. And it was there the next year, the same tracks, throughout that area of the old growth, but I'd never could conclusively found anything. But fish is another animal that's found in the weasel family, rather large, found mostly in the Upper Peninsula, but there's been sightings of that here in northern lower as well. And let's go back to deer. So deer populations, without getting into the weeds, because when you talk to hunters, they'll say that I'm not seeing any deer. When we know that deer are here, because from a forestry standpoint, you can see the understory, right? And you can see how that browse line, right? Yeah. And so cedar forests, way back before European settling, when the Anishinaabeg were here, I would have loved to have been back around that time where you look into a cedar forest and you don't see the forest floor. It's all just regenerating. Yeah. And of course, with habitat degradation, deer move into areas where they need food, and now we've got shopping malls and we've got subdivisions, and so the deer are being relocated, so to speak, right? Oh, geez, what else do we have? Did I miss any species?
I was hoping you'd mention pine marten and fisher, and you did cover those.
Yeah, so. Yeah, and so those populations are found mostly in the Upper Peninsula where there's lots. Yeah. There's not as the big of a population. I mean, they're not going to be downtown Marquette. Yeah. But when you get out to the Porcupine Mountains, you're bound to see anything.
I mean, talking about the pine marten, that reminds me from back on. I think you were there too at the time. I know you were working with us, but John Gregorich our park manager at the time, park supervisor, I remember he telling us that he had seen a pine marten here in the park.
Okay, right.
And John was from the Upper Peninsula, so he was very knowledgeable on the wildlife and longtime DNR employee. So he had sworn he'd seen. And if I recall from just knowledge I gained from working alongside everybody in the DNR, is that there had been releases of reintroductions of pine marten over in the Cadillac area, then I think in the Pigeon River. So
I remember Huron-Manistee National Forest, for sure. Yeah. And I think it was CMU that was doing the research on that, if I recall. I do remember having it was a January afternoon, and my supervisor at the time was coming for a meeting with me, and we parked in the upper parking lot, and you could see distinctively the tracks. Yeah. And my supervisor at the time is from the UP and avid hunter and outdoors person. And I'm like, John, what are these? And he's like, that's pine marten.
Yeah.
And he would know, right? And if anybody knew. So I'm like, we got pine marten.
Didn't we follow it to a
that
snag
snag.
that was an old maple snag or something like that in the sugar bush area?
Just waiting to see it, and we never did.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we knew we had one.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know, and I'm certainly not a wildlife biologist, but after doing this for a couple of decades, you learn stuff every day, right? Then somebody comes in and said, what's the gestation period of a raccoon? I'm like, I don't know. You look it up, it's 63 days. And, well, you just commit that to memory and spit it out when you need to. But it makes sense that if you have a creature that's living here, any species, whatever, they have the instinct to do two things, probably more than two, but food, right, and also mate and reproduce. So if you have a pine marten that's here and it's either female or male and there's no counterpart, why stick around? Mm-hmm. So you move on. And that's the same thing with cougars. So let's talk about that a little bit because I know that's a hot topic. Excuse me. There have been cougar sightings in Michigan. What the DNR's standpoint is on that is that we don't know of any breeding pairs. And you think about all the people that go out in the woods with their game cameras. We've never seen kittens, right? Mm-hmm. So from what we believe is that they're transient, right? They come walking through an area and they're on their way somewhere else. I went to a presentation about one in Minnesota that walked all the way almost down to southern Minnesota, and the next day was found in northern Minnesota. It's like, okay, well, they just keep walking, right? Mm-hmm. So, and they're looking for food, looking for a mate. But yeah, so, and that's not even getting into the bird species, right, that utilize forests. There's certain bird species that utilize swamp conifers. Excuse me. There are certain bird species that like northern hardwood forest. We have a bird here called the ovenbird, right? And it's in the thrush family, and it goes teacher, 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 teacher. Well, it nests underneath the leaves, the dead leaves of beech maple forest. But we hear it in the old growth forest more than we hear it in the hardwood forest. So it's finding its food that in a forest type that's adjacent to where it nests. So just because it utilizes a northern hardwood forest, it might want to find the food that has hemlock and spruce and fir in it as well, right?
Yeah. Yeah, when I was out east in October, went out to New England, and I was hiking in a forest out there that was a hardwood forest area and had conifers in the area too. And I heard a ovenbird out there.
Oh, cool.
I knew exactly what it was when it did teacher, teacher, teacher. Yeah. Working with all you naturalists, I learned a little bit. But no, the one other thing I wanted to mention too is that I've been lucky enough to have seen a fisher in the Upper Peninsula.
Did you really?
Running across a road. I was coming back. I don't remember where I was at. I think I had gone up to Marquette, Negaunee area to work with some of the iron industry guys, and I was coming down the state highway, McMillan, I think, area, connecting back from M28 down to US 2, and it ran across the road about 100 yards or so in front of me, and it's like I recognized it because of the mount here in the exhibit hall, and so it's like that's a fisher. I thought that was pretty darn impressive to see that.
And it's funny how when you all the visitors that we've seen over the years as coworkers. The stories that they tell, right? Yeah. And so, some of them are, okay, sure, you saw it, okay. But, of course, you don't discount them. They just want to be heard. But we had a year, I don't remember if it was like 2007, 2008, where in the Presque Isle area, right by Alpena here, the guy came up and he's like, I saw one of those dead on the side of the road. I'm like, where are you from? And he told me the Rogers City area kind of thing. Well, we had really rainy summer that year, and the culvert was filled. So that bridge that goes over that culvert, it was just a sea of opossums and raccoons and dead things because instead of using the culvert, they had to go above the road. Okay. And he's like, I saw that what's that called? I said, it's a fisher. He goes, I saw it in the exhibit hall, and now I know what that was. And so back then, even then, he said, I saw one. So they're around. They got a picture of one probably about 2010, something like that, and it was in the paper, but. So they're around.
Yeah,
bobcats. We didn't mention bobcats too.
No, absolutely,
right?
bobcats.
So bobcats are around. Of course, the Canada lynx is no longer a thing.
Yeah.
They used to be here. I think the last sighting was up in Canada as it was coming down. There was some ice dams, and so it was walking across, but it never got to Michigan. But,
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you on that. Yeah, we definitely have lots of wildlife species that were, here because of the forest.
Yeah.
And so why, though? What characteristics of here? We'll look at Hartwick Pines here specifically, the old growth forest, and of course that applies to other old growth forests around. And so not specifically, pine, but an old growth forest. Sure. What makes that a good place for wildlife? I mean, you mentioned a little bit of the understory and for deer and all of that, but what else is that would be cool to see the wildlife, or why?
Let's go over the specific characteristics of an old growth forest, right? So to have a typical old growth coniferous forest with the evergreen species, you have pit and mound topography. So when these trees come down, the root systems are sticking up, right, on the ground. That root ball that was there now creates a pit. That eventually decays, and the root ball decays, and the pit fills in with detritus, leaf litter, and now you've got this mosaic on the forest floor of these humps and valleys, right, on a small scale. Because it's a closed canopy and the branches from tree next to another tree are holding themselves together, kind of, there's a lot of shade. So we don't see a lot of understory development, except where trees come down and then create what's called canopy gaps or gap dynamics. And then that allows young species to grow, in this case, at least in our case, beech and maple saplings start to come up. Well, because that creates a lot more edge in that quarter of an acre area where now sunlight's penetrating the forest floor, you start to see raspberry come in. Well, I don't know if deer eat raspberry. I'm sure they probably do. But either way, they like to eat leaves, right? They're herbivores. Well, if you've got raspberries, then you've got animals that like to eat raspberries, such as snowshoe hare or eastern cottontails. Well, eastern cottontails are not going to be found in the heart of the old growth forest where there's nothing to eat, but in those edge areas near the gap dynamic areas, now you've got raspberry. Now you see that. Well, if you see, now you see. So if you've got those snowshoe hare or eastern cottontails, well, then that's a food source for bobcat. So the connection of, once again, they want to reproduce and they want to eat. Well, the food source for the predators has to be those prey species that are here. And if we don't have them, porcupines, for example, we've got as well. We didn't mention that, but we find them in the old growth. You and I would do snowshoe hikes, and we'd see it once we know.
I remember that.
We would go out and say, let's go see if it's still there. It's still there. And it was like they're all winter long. Well, one of the main food sources for fishers are porcupines. So if we were to have more fishers, then we would lower the population of the porcupine, that sort of thing. But back to the old growth. So because of the lack of understory vegetation, it's perfect and ideal for deer because they don't have to walk through that dog hair, understory development. We all think of deer as being forest-dwelling critters, but they're herd animals. They like to be out in the open. If anybody drives up I-75 or 131 in Michigan, where do we see deer? On the side of the road.
Yeah.
They use the forest for cover and for safety, but they're not necessarily forest-dwelling creatures. They are here because we're off limits to hunting, and they know that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Red squirrels, a lot of those we find. So we have another species of squirrel called the 13-line ground squirrel. It's not found in the old growth forest. It's not the right habitat. But you go to our campground and it's grassy, and they look like little miniature prairie dogs, right? They're all over our campground because the campground's not fully open, but a lot of the campsites are open. So yeah, it's species specific to the forest. the more unique species that we have are bird species, because this is the only type of forest, an old growth pine forest around. Certain species will come here that like that mature forest. One in specific bird is the northern parula, which is in the in a warbler family. The evening grosbeak. We've got a lot of hemlock besides the pines, and they like to eat the seeds, and they also like to nest in hemlock. Well, we've got the hemlock, right? So, big story, big concern is hemlock woolly adelgid, right? And if that comes in, and that started out in east and has gone through Pennsylvania and New York and decimated thousands upon thousands and millions of hemlock. Well, if it comes here, how is that going to affect us? Well, we're going to lose the evening grosbeak, which is a big draw for birders that come here. Where's the evening grosbeak? It's a lifer for a lot of people.
Just for listeners who don't know what it is, explain quickly, briefly, what hemlock woolly
Sure.
adelgid is.
So it's like an aphid. So it's a small little insect. The nymphs, the young stage, they are white, and it looks like little snowflakes, or clumps of snow that they feed on the base of the needle of the hemlock, and then that stresses the tree out, and eventually the tree dies. So we've not seen it here yet, but with climate change and things that are moving around, right now, foresters that I talked to a long time ago here at Hartwick Pines said, "Oh, you won't have to worry about it. You get very harsh winters." Well, if our winters stop being harsh, they are this year, in terms of how cold it's been, they can't survive that. So we're seeing most of the hemlock woolly adelgids along the coast of Michigan. So all the way from, they've just made it their way. They started off at like Hoffmaster area, and they made their way up the coast. Now it's Sleeping Bear Dunes. So it's because of the temperature of the warmer temperatures by Lake Michigan, they continue to survive, and they don't get frosted out or perish because of the cold temperatures.
Yeah. I remember visiting Smoky Mountains about 15 years ago, and they had notifications about why are all the hemlocks dying, and talking about the woolly adelgia there. And I think I brought back pamphlets for you to share with you at the time. So
that's a big concern for sure.
Yeah. So definitely our forests are changing, and that will affect what we have there. And I was really glad you hit on the evening grosbeak, because although I was hoping to see one today while I was here, I wasn't really expecting to. But that was always, I know, the life list bird or birds for birders coming in the springtime when they'd be up here for the warblers. So,
and they should be back soon. I mean, I've been keeping my own mental phenology report on when we see them. And as you know, we would see them occasionally in December for 2 days, and then we wouldn't see them again. And the next year I'd see them in January, but then they'd be gone. But once they usually return around March. So hopefully soon we'll be hearing them and seeing them, and that's big draw.
Yeah. So this kind of goes into, there was a big events that happened here in Michigan and in the Great Lakes region in the forests in the 19th century, the big lumber boom. And listeners to the podcast already have heard me speak about that. Yeah. And so that's something we won't get back into here. But how did that disruption of the forest, the logging, the harvesting of the forest at such vast numbers, and then, in turn, a lot of the wildfires that came through after that from the leftover slash and whatnot, how did that affect the wildlife that were living there in the forest? I mean, what we see today is totally different what would have been here in, say, 1860 before they started logging in this particular area. Right. And so I imagine the wildlife is very different between then and now as well.
Yeah. One thing to point out to kind of preface that, to think about the fact that when we had this lumber boom, cities like Grayling were just small, and then they became big. So not only was it logging, but it was overfishing, overharvesting. You look at some of the old black and white photos of a couple guys standing there, and there's like 18 bucks hanging, and a couple coyotes and pheasants and grouse and fish just upon the Grayling, for example, right? We'll talk about forest But the grayling was affected by the lumber boom because they did the river drives, and that choked up the rivers, so they weren't as clean and cool. You had log jams and sand that deposited, bank erosion, and the grayling liked all that stuff.
Yes.
Well, that also is affected the beaver population, right? And granted, beavers are forest related because they chew on trees, but they like to be near water. Well, they were extirpated from Michigan as well. Pine marten was also a species that was extirpated. Of course, for those who don't know what that means, instead of being extinct, extirpated means a species is removed from its original range but still found somewhere else. So the pine marten was gone from Michigan but still found in Wisconsin and Minnesota and Canada, right? Yeah. Deer population was probably the key element for how it was affected. As I said a couple minutes ago, deer are open land creatures. They use the forest for safety. Well, now they've got a lot of open land because it's not forested anymore. Population goes up. So once again, do we have too many deer or not enough deer? Well, we got a lot of deer. Right, and that's evidence from what I said before. So the deer population really was a major component of how things changed from a wildlife standpoint back after the logging era. The other issue that happened is when we started moving up here as a species, and you wanted to start farming. Well, you don't want wolves nearby. You don't want coyotes nearby. So you get rid of all the predators, and the deer go unchecked. So the only predator the deer had was us. And if you don't hunt, then there's more deer, right? But once again, it goes back to the pine marten, right? So the pine marten needs, well, all animals. We tell this to the visitors and specifically our school groups. Wildlife look for four things. They look for food, water, shelter, and space. By space, I mean that there's enough space for all of us to have enough resources to survive. So we've got right now 49 acres of old growth forest at Hartwick Pines. That's not enough to sustain X number of this species and X number of this species and X number of this species. So, excuse me, a lot of it depends on the acreage of the forest, and way back in the 1890s when this area of Michigan was being harvested, it was just all pretty much clear cut. So you had open area. So everything was affected by that too. I mean, you think about squirrels. Where are squirrels found? Anywhere there's trees. Well, we didn't have trees. So the population of squirrels probably, I don't know for a fact, but probably was not as high. There's no food for them. They don't eat the acorns. They don't eat the other seeds that they could find. So everything was affected, probably adversely, except the deer was benefited from all of that.
Yeah. Yeah. So do you know of any wildlife that would have maybe come in afterwards because of anything that found the new open areas attractive to spread into the region? I would
think that eventually. So once trees started to regenerate, we call that succession. So after the seeds are laid dormant in the bottom of the forest floor, and then once enough rain, enough sunlight comes through, they regenerate. Or from the tree stump, you get stump sprouts. And so, 5-10 years after an area was logged, regeneration starts. So that young forest. So once you get young forest, you could have rough grouse that would come in because they need young forest to nest in. But the rough grouse, for example, needs a drumming log when it's trying to attract a mate. Well, that means you need old dead trees. Well, all the old dead trees were cut, right? There might have been logs on the ground, so they could still do that part of that. But they also like to eat the catkins that come down from the aspen. Well, it takes about 20 years for the tree to be old enough to produce that. Well, or maybe even younger than that, maybe 15 years. So they need the food. They need to mate, once again, and they need to nest. and so they need the young stuff to nest. And so there was probably an increase in certain bird species that like that young successional forest. And if you bring those in, well, now you've got animals that want to eat their eggs and eat the young. So fox probably increased too. Red fox, gray fox. I didn't mention that, but gray fox are like to live in a mature hardwood forest or a mature forest in general. The red fox likes open areas where it can hunt for field mice. So the different habitats between just a fox species, the two fox species that we have in Michigan, is kind of unique as well.
Okay. Yeah. No, what I had in mind was I learned this, and it was before you came to work at the park, that Michigan at one time had a population of greater prairie chicken. That came in.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Came in after the lumber, after the fires, for the most part, opened up a lot of the area, and how they ended up here. How they figured out to come here, but they had migrated from. Now you look at where the prairie chicken range is. It's pretty much Nebraska, where I was living at for a while, Kansas, places like that. But I think it ranged into Illinois and Indiana and the old prairies along there. But they had moved their way up to Michigan, and as late as I want to say 1986. This is what I learned from some DNR biologists at the time. As I mentioned, it was before you were here at the park. It was Ann Stevens here then. And but like 1986 was like the last time one was seen in Michigan. It was in Otsego County, so just north of here. But the fact is that because the forests came back, they had less and less habitat. So and I know that the sharp-tailed grouse up in the UP came into the area of the Kingston Plains, which I just spoke about in an episode a few weeks back. And that's something that the DNR manages for habitat for up there still. But that was something too. It was I don't think it would be considered an invasive species. It just came in on its own. It was a non-native species. But then they stayed.
Advantageous.
Yes.
Right? So along those lines too, another thing that we saw an increase in after the massive harvesting, not necessarily just of the pines, but also when you moved into southern Michigan, was the cowbird, the brown-headed cowbird, right? So the brown-headed cowbird followed the bison herd across the Great Plains. Well, there's evidence that the bison herd was found like in southern Michigan as they would move along as well. Well, brown-headed cowbird is a brood parasitizer, if let's say that very awkwardly. So basically the female lays her eggs in another bird's nest, and then she would then follow the bison herd and let the other bird species, whether it was a yellow-rumped warbler or the Kirtland's warbler or what have you. So their population really started to increase too, just because there was so much they like to live, or they like to find the birds that live on the edge of a forest. And of course, bison are open range creatures, so they would fly to the edge of a forest, lay their eggs, and then follow the bison herd. So that increased as well. There was one other one that as you were talking, two other species. So we had woodland caribou.
Yes. Yeah.
And they've been extirpated. The only remaining native woodland caribou herd is found in Quebec.
Okay.
We also had elk. Now, I always thought that people were like, no, it's woodland caribou. No. So now, of course, in the Vanderbilt area in the Pigeon River country, back in 1918, there were Rocky Mountain elk that were brought over from the Rocky Mountains, and now we've got an elk herd. So we did have elk as well. Those were removed because we didn't have the forest that they needed anymore. So that yet another species.
Thanks there. This has been really good so far, and I was really worried, Craig, because of the way you and I have conversations. I thought this would go on and on and on, and we've been talking for barely a half hour at this point. But we're well into everything here today. But why don't we turn a little bit to what you do, not just here at Hartwick Pines, but within the realm of the Department of Natural Resources.
Okay.
So, go ahead.
So So, and it's funny too, because when I tell people I'm a park interpreter, of course, the first question is, what languages do you speak? Right. And it's like, no. So how I phrase that is, as you said in the beginning, a naturalist. That's a little easier to comprehend, I think. But I tell people that I interpret the things that can't speak for themselves. So why is the bird making that call instead of this song? Or why is the tree exhibiting leaf change in the middle of the summer, right? So I interpret nature for people is what I interpret. And I think there's a lot of people that, including, well, you and I mean, you're from Chelsea and I'm from St. Clair Shores. I grew up as a city kid in a subdivision, right? I had a tree in the backyard that I climbed. That was my experience. Of course, I had relatives that lived outside of Traverse City. So you'd go up and they had a farm. So it was a farm. It was more about chickens and the pigs they had than it was going out into the woods. But just telling people more and trying to get people excited and enthusiastic about nature and to ask the questions like, why is that or what is that? I like to use the example of why is it important to know that flower is a yellow trout lily? Well, once you know the name of something, I'm under the impression and the theory that once you know the name of something, you care for it more. And I use the example of, okay, you're driving down the road and there's somebody that has a flat tire. Are you going to stop and help them? No. But if you're driving down the road and it's a relative or a friend that you know, you're going to pull over. Well, no, because you know them.
Yeah.
So maybe you care more about the yellow trout lily than you did before because you know its name. The birds themselves are just fascinating because of all the different kinds of things that they do. The way that the white-breasted nuthatch takes seeds and puts them underneath the bark of a tree, and then later on, when there's no food in my feeder, go back and find those seeds. That's just interesting. Of course, I think just getting people to understand that there's a lot that they don't know about it, and maybe they do care more about it. I found that during COVID. Here's something interesting. So we do the Kirtland's Warbler tours out of here. And because of COVID, and we all were stuck at home, if we all remember that, the next year that we did the Kirtland's Warbler tour, we saw an uptick, because we didn't do them in 2020, but we resumed them. Now there were people in 2021 that were coming to the Kirtland's Warbler tours without binoculars because they just heard about this bird.
Yeah.
Because they were at home and they're looking at their feeders going, wow, look at all those birds. Let's get a field guide. And so they started knowing birds more. So one silver lining thing about COVID that was interesting is I got a lot of people watching their bird feeders now because instead of being, at work, they were at home watching the behaviors. So I think that was a kind of a really cool thing. Of course, a lot of people started camping too, which didn't know how to camp, and that was fun to watch too. But anyway,
yeah, a lot of tales.
Yeah. So here at the park, I focus mostly on the natural resource side of interpretation. Of course, we've got our old growth forest. So I talk about forest types. I talk about the habitat needs for certain species of animals, certain plants that are found there. It's not just the old growth trail or not just the old growth forest that's on the trail. It goes through a northern hardwood stand, a mixed forest, which mixed forest, for those who don't know, has mixture of conifers and deciduous trees. So you see different kinds of plants that are growing there than you do in the old growth. Getting people to understand why they will see certain animals in certain areas, but not in other areas. It's because it's a habitat change, right? We do animal-based programs. So whether it's as simple as a scavenger hunt, look for an animal track. We'll do animal track programs. I do a program where I've got a tote full of animal skins and blindfold the kids, and then they got to guess what it is blindfolded. And then they sit back down, and then I tell an anecdotal story about that animal. So it's not just, good, you guessed it, go sit down. And I make it a point to make sure that the parents get a kick out of things too. And parents generally will come up afterwards like, I didn't know that. I'm like, well, good. It's not just about the kids. It's about getting the parents interested too. of course, we have the different main events. One thing that's going to be coming up soon, which is the rite of spring, is called Maple Syrup Day. And you remember what we would do is we'd go out, and as soon as we'd see 40 degrees in the future of the next week's schedule, we'd go out and start tapping trees, collect sap, get the snowshoes on, bring it back in buckets, and then we have an event that when we used to do it used to be the last week in March. We now do it the second week in April, just because sometimes we don't get sap until the first week in April. And then we're like, well, we're just boiling water. What you would want to see normally would be sap, but we just put syrup in here to make it smell nice.
Yeah. Which we did a few times.
Which we tell them that's what we did. We're not lying to them. Yeah. But and that's a great thing too. And we get school groups that come out. A lot of homeschool groups will come out and say, hey, can you do a tapping demonstration? So we don't tap all of the trees all at once. We leave some so that we can go out in the forest and or along the trail and put in a couple of spiles.
And on the history side, with everything that we did here while I was working here, that is still the program that I miss the most, not working at this park, is Maple Syrup Day. And when I was briefly working out in Nebraska, I thought, this would be a great place to do it, except for one important thing: the lack of maple trees.
Maple trees.
So that was out there.
Yeah.
So
tapping an oak tree is,
I mean, we had maple trees, but we didn't have a sap run. That was the problem. It's that we'd get warm so fast. The sap run might be for one day.
Wow.
So it was nothing like here in the north. So.
Yeah, and I think that's a misconception too, that people think that just maple trees have sap. No, all trees have sap, but it's just stored in the ground, and eventually the buds start to swell because the tree trunk is getting warmed by the sun and the ground's warming up, and that pressure that drives the sap from the roots to the top of the tree is when we're collecting it. We're not collecting it on the way down. We're collecting it on the way up.
So do you have a date or when Maple Syrup Day is?
It's the second Saturday in April. So if I think about that, would be the 12th.
April 12th.
April 12th,
all right.
Yeah.
So,
but we'll be tapping trees hopefully within a week or two.
Yeah.
I'd like to see above freezing. That'd be nice.
Well, when I got here today, coming up to the park, and I've been up here in Grayling for a couple days, but you had your school group that you took out snowshoeing, and so I was getting my snowshoes on to go off in my own area or whatever, but since I parked right up there by the sugar bush where that concentration of sugar maple and red maple are, I was just looking out there, and it's like today, the temperature today feels like you should be going out there tapping trees, and with the sun and everything, and because I know that there were times in mid-February we started tapping.
We did, so. And in fact, even last year there was a whole week where it was above 40, and above freezing at night, and so we didn't get a lot of sap because it was too warm. And then tailing off to get cold again, we're like, we got a little bit. Well, we just get basically ice because it wasn't flowing. But it was a pretty good year last year, actually. Yeah. But you never know.
Yeah, last year I came up the same week, and I didn't even bring my snowshoes.
Right, yes. Yeah.
And this time I was wallowing in, 3 foot, 4 foot deep snow because of the drifts. And
we had a lot this year. A lot of people are happy, though.
I know from where I stay at when I come up here. I was talking to the manager today, and he was much happier with this winter than last year. So,
for sure.
And stopped in at the Grayling restaurant for my traditional breakfast. They still know my order of
nice.
Cinnamon raisin French toast, and I was chatting with the waitresses there, and again, especially weekends for everybody coming up. So the weather, the climate change, it's been a really big sticking point up here, I know.
Yeah, and to that end, I mean, we talk about at the end of the winter, we're looking at Maple Syrup Day, but like today we had a school group, but we also offer us guided snowshoe hikes just about every other Saturday. And last year, so I think we do one at 10 and at 1 o'clock, and I think we held them four or five different days last year. Yeah. Last year we had one that we used snowshoes. Yeah. All the rest were boot hikes. Yeah. And it was icy and it was just nasty. But this year, it's like, all right, put the snowshoes on. You know.
And this is going to air in a few weeks from when we're recording. We're recording on February 21, and I know that on February 22nd, so the day tomorrow after when we're recording, you've got a snowshoe hike. But for people hearing this, it's going to be too late for this year.
Yes.
So they'll have to look to check out the schedule for next year.
Yep, and we also have snowshoes that if you want to come and borrow them, they're free of charge. We're open just on the weekends, though, so if you come up for the weekend, our cross-country ski trails are groomed on a weekly basis because we're getting snow every day anyway, so once a week they're at least groomed, so that's great.
Yeah, no, it's a great place to be. So anything else you want to kind of follow up on here?
No, I guess the only other thing is I mentioned it briefly about the Kirtland's Warbler Tours. Starting in 2014, we started doing the Kirtland Warbler Tours out of here in cooperation with the Michigan Audubon. And we do those from Memorial Weekend through June 30th. Though you sign up for pre-registration on the michiganaudubon.org site, and it's $10. We usually hire between Audubon and me. We interview different, generally students. We've had a couple of retired folks that lead the tours. They do it 5 days a week, and I give that person 2 days off, and I'll do it a couple of days a week too. But it just, Rob, it's still, even 10 years later, amazing to see, like, you're from where? Austria. Okay. Wow. Philippines. Good for you. Oh, okay. Japan. Good for you. You know, let alone almost not every county. We're still missing a couple UP counties, but there's generally at least 40 to 50 counties represented from Michigan that come here, as well as all over the United States. And just to see this little bird, which is great.
I went on a couple of the tours when Audubon was doing them out of the, it was the Holiday Inn and the Ramada Inn. I don't know what it is now, Ramada. If it's still the Ramada in Grayling. And I did that just to see what it was like and went on the tours. And I remember meeting people from different areas. And then when I had the lighthouse at Tawas Point as part of my interpretive duties too for the Tawas Point Birding Festival, and the people coming from all over the world. And Kirtland's Warbler was the main attraction. But I mean, the migration there at Tawas in general was the big event.
I've yet to get out there because that's at the same time we have school groups.
Yes, of course it is.
You know. But so let's backtrack a little bit. That's a great point. So we talked about fires and how things were affected. Well, the Kirtland's Warbler nests in young jackpine, 5 to 20 years old, 5 to 20 feet tall. Conifers in general self-prune. They drop their lower branches. Well, after all the fires that came through, the cone of the jackpine is called a serotinous cone. It's got this waxy coating, and it needs to burn by fire. And as the fire goes away, the tree is still smoldering, the cone opens up and the seeds drop out. Well, if we had a lot of fires, you can only imagine that we had lots of areas of jackpine that regenerated. Yes. The population back then, nobody was counting the Kirtland's Warbler in the 1860s and 1870s, but I'm sure the population would have majorly increased because we had a lot of young jackpine. As things move on, the brown-headed cowbird comes in, starts parasiticizing the nest, so that dropped the population. Plus, we stopped wildfires because people started building their homes next to jackpine, and that's not good for a homeowner. So the population really crashed. And back in 1973, the population was down to 176 singing males, and we assumed that there were about 176 females. So you're looking at just a 300-plus population. Now it's off the endangered species list, thankfully, back in 2019, and the population's up to probably around just over 4,500, 5,000 birds. So it's on the mend, which is great. But it all has to do with forests as well. Back in the day when there were wildfires rampant, jackpine in 5 years is going to be prime habitat for them to nest in.
And I remember there were along the scenic drive in the park, there was that stand of mature Jack pine, and that probably dated back to the last fire coming in through the park, which was probably the 1920s at that time.
Yeah.
And I imagine most of those trees are probably dead now because
Well,
we're talking a century now, so
Yeah,
those trees are
yeah.
probably
And
past
a lot
their
of those
lifespan.
jack pine, of course, they didn't regenerate because there was no fire that went through after that.
Yeah.
And now it's converted to white pine and black cherry.
Yeah. So well, this has been great. I've got one last question for you, and
I'm a Leo.
that's good. That was not my question.
Okay, I was trying to guess that one.
I'm a Libra, but again, not my question.
I know you're a Libra.
So, okay, this is getting kind of creepy now, Craig. Let's get back on the subject here. Is that because I want people to take something emotional from the forest when they visit the forest, and so it's something I want to ask all my guests on the podcast. And you are only my second guest so far. Your coworker, Hillary Pine, she was my first guest on the episode a few weeks ago about Hartwick Pines State Park, where we're at today. And I'll ask others throughout. But how does the forest make you feel? Emotionally, spiritually, or however you want to take that question?
I guess I'll answer this in several ways. One, at home, right? Of course, I went into forestry, and one thing that I thought was going to be challenging for me, because I think everybody loves forests. I don't know, but like I said, when I was growing up, we had a tree in the backyard. And then we go somewhere where there's forests, and it was like, this is kind of cool, right? It's not something I'm used to in St. Clair Shores. But when you're surrounded by, when I come to work and I work here, as you did, and you take the drive in, and you see the trees, and as the seasons change, you notice things. But I thought after I got my degree in forestry that I would be jaded and I would start analyzing the forest. What species are there? What do we look at? It hasn't at all. Because of my fine arts background as well, there are different hues of green that as a forester I can look and go, well, that's a different color of green. And most people just go, they're all green. Well, there's a light green, there's a dark green. Some of the leaves are shiny. Some of the leaves are fuzzy below and lighter below. And so all of these little things that I try to interpret and give to guests to make them have a better appreciation of forests is part of my jam, right? So I feel at home. Where I live up in Gaylord, there's 2 empty lots next to my house. So I go from being here where I'm surrounded by trees to home where I'm surrounded by trees. And when I go downstate to visit my family, they've got trees, but I just feel out of place. I don't feel, it's not my comfort zone anymore. I'm like, all right, I need more trees. I need trees, right? So definitely home. I feel at home. I feel comfortable within it. And I think knowing your forest a little bit better would make you feel more comfortable. I mean, we've got a lot of city kids that come here, right? And families. And you can see the fear in some of their eyes, like, are there bear here? And of course, because I'm a jerk, I'm like, oh yeah, we got bear. You do? Yeah, but not in the old growth. Oh, well, why not? I'm like, well, they need food. There's no blueberries here. There's no raspberries here. There's some raspberries, but I mean, there's also people with dogs. So the bear are not coming to the old growth forest. They're in the park, but not here. So I explained that to him in a nice way. But if you know your forest types, then you know you wouldn't see bear. Don't be afraid of seeing a bear on this trail, right? Now, you go to the Au Sable Trail, Mertz grade, maybe you'll see a bear, So it's the knowledge of the forest that I think is important for people to understand a little bit more about it, and then they have that comfort zone. They're like, okay with it. And I remember the first time that I first started here with you, we had a gal that was working for us, and I took an old growth tour with her, and she said, I want everybody to stay on the trail because this forest is very fragile from an ecosystem standpoint. And I'm like, I don't know about that, but okay. And so once everybody had gone away, it was in November. It was a nice warm day. And I walked off the trail and I'm like, all right, bunchberry, wood fern, fringe polygala, roundleaf hepatica. There's nothing sensitive about this. What she was doing was misinterpreting the forest to keep people afraid of being off the trail. It's protected. It's not sensitive. And so I made it a habit for me, when nobody was looking, to run off into the old growth forest and sit my back up against a pine and just sit there and take in the sounds and take in the beauty of that forest and quiet, right? And it's very serene. It's very comforting.
I have a tree here at the park in the old growth forest that I still do that when I come visit.
Oh, good for you.
I didn't do it today because with all the snow, and it was a different area than where I snowshoed.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've done that in the past year too. And I make sure there's no one around to see me go off the trail. And where I go to, you can't be seen from the trail either.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I get totally how you feel on that.
Yeah. And I remember you and I, when we would do our snowshoe hikes, we'd usually take the same route.
Yeah.
Well, one day we were like, well, let's see what's over here. And you and I went out past the visitor center a different way, and we were looking at trees that we had never seen before.
That's where I was today, yes.
And I'm like, this is great, you know? And that's where we found the vernal pool that one day. I'm like, well, I didn't know this was here.
That's how we found that porcupine den.
Right. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So,
Good times, man. That was great.
So, well, fantastic answer, Craig. And I love to hear, how other people feel about it. And I told you off air about one of my old coworkers from the Department of History, Arts, and Libraries. And he was commenting on the podcast to me and how it made him feel when he first started coming up here to Hartwick Pines to work on exhibits. Yeah. So yeah, it affects everybody in so totally different ways.
Yeah. And let me add one more thing. So of course, the headquarters of the Department of Natural Resources is in Lansing, right? We have a place south of here called the R.A. McMullen Center, right? And a lot of classes, a lot of workshops there, that kind of thing. Whenever I go down there, because it's so close, and you and I would be always called to, hey, can you do a program? Because we're closest. When my colleagues from Lansing come up, there's a calmness about their face because I'm up north. And it's different than living in the concrete jungle of Lansing where you're like, well, there's trees, but it's not a forest. You can just see that. A lot of stress wash away from their faces when they're there like, this is great, right? Yeah. And it does have, I think, a positive effect on a lot of people.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Craig, for being my guest here today.
My pleasure.
And our parting gift. Sorry, there are no parting gifts right now. I'm running this out of my own pocket right now. So
I love it.
But no, thank you for agreeing to be my guest today. And just always for people, if they want to come for a fantastic experience in the forest, come up to Hartwick Pines State Park. It's just a couple miles east of Interstate 75 on State Highway M93. It's the next exit past Grayling. And, come for a few hours, come for a day, camp at the park. You're going to have a fantastic experience with Craig and his staff, with Hillary and her staff on the history side of it, who people heard a couple weeks ago. And you're going to learn a little bit about not just Hartwick Pines, but Michigan history, Michigan's forests. I know that when I was here, the visitor center was known as the Michigan Forest Visitor Center. And I think you probably got tired of telling people when you answered the phone that, yes, this is Hartwick Pines State Park. So now it's the Hartwick Pines Visitor Center. Yes. But yes, no, it's such a great place to go. And people know that this is a special place in my heart. It's where I became a forest history historian, an environmental historian. And even though I haven't worked here in the park for 12 years, I mean, it still has what made me in my career, and why we're doing the podcast now is to kind of, as my way of continuing to interpret, to educate. And as you know, Craig, and I was visiting with my cousin yesterday who lives here in Grayling, and he's a retired school teacher. I was telling him, I've been an educator my entire adult life. I just didn't do it in a classroom.
Yep.
So
Yeah. And there are people that still come here and go, "Where's Rob?"
Wow.
And I know. And I'm like, "Where have you been?" Because it's been 12 years,
Yeah.
but they have, and we get that, as you know, we get people that come here and go, "I haven't been here in 30 years," or "I come here every year." So everybody's always welcome here, of course, whether it's been a decade since you've been here or it's been 50 years since you were a kid.
Of course, I came here in '98, and 3 years previous was Wendell Hoover, the longtime park interpreter who did double duty as the naturalist and the historian.
Right.
And when he left the park, and for years, people ask where Wendell Hoover was, and I know that you got that too. You were the second interpreter after Wendell, and I know that your predecessor, who was there when I came in, she had a really tough time dealing with that. And I once, even in the airport in Charleston, South Carolina, I was down visiting my sister who lives down there, and I was waiting for the flight to go back to Detroit to fly then up to Traverse City. And there was a couple I got to talking to with their young son, and they were from East Jordan or Boyne City, one of the two, I don't remember which. But I mentioned, working at Hartwick Pines, and they asked about Wendell Hoover. But the kid looked at me, staring at me. It's like, you gave me my field trip last year.
Yay.
So that was cool to be recognized for that.
I know. Isn't that crazy?
So, that's the thing. You mentioned people coming from all over the world for Kirtland's warblers. Well, they come out here. Yeah. And they also then remember us, too, if we do a good job.
Oh, yeah.
And hopefully if we do a bad job, they forget about us.
No, and I used to say, just so everybody who's listening knows, after a program's over, I'd say, so if you really liked what we did here today, my name's Craig. If you didn't like it, my name's Rob. So they'd, of course, laugh.
Of course, I threw you under the bus the same way.
Yeah,
So,
we were good with that.
Yeah. So thanks again, Craig. Thanks, everybody, for listening today. And just remember, if you really enjoy the show, tell somebody about it. Yes, subscribe, download the episodes, everything like that you can. But let's spread the word. Let's tell others about North Country History with Rob Berg. And I'm already working on not just season 2, but planning for season 3 and season 4 and trips. I'm going to in August, going to be going to Wisconsin and Minnesota to do some podcast episodes, to do some interviewing and recording. And then the next year, I'm going to Canada. Going to be back in 2026 in Ontario and doing some of Northern Ontario and the forest there. So we've got big plans for North Country History with Rob Berg. And thanks again. Thanks for listening. And we'll talk to you again soon. Bye. North Country History with Rob Berg is hosted, written, and produced by Rob Berg. Music is Crack o' Dawn, performed by Reveille, licensed through Soundstripe. Follow North Country History with Rob Berg on YouTube and on Facebook at Rob Berg, Environmental Historian.